As well, when it comes to aggression, what I always recommend is when you're planning your tank, when you're adding fish to your tank, always What's up, everybody? It's Collin at Tye-Dyed Iguana, and today we're in the fish department. In today's video, we're going to be discussing considerations when it comes to adding new livestock to your aquarium or planning livestock for an aquarium. So when it comes to planning livestock for your aquarium or selecting if a fish is going to be an appropriate candidate for a new addition to your aquarium, there's four main characteristics or four main categories that I like to focus on when we're considering adding that new fish or planning what fish are going to go into this aquarium. The first thing would be natural environment. So what type of water parameters and where is this fish found in the wild? The second thing I would consider would be morphology/behavior. Where is this fish naturally occupying in the environment, or what is the typical behavior pattern that this fish typically exemplifies? What is the size of this fish? How big are these fish going to get, and would they be a good mix together? The last thing would be the aggression of the fish, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the biome or the natural habitat that these fish occupy. When you're wanting to consider adding a new fish to your tank, or if you're starting a new tank from scratch, you certainly want to be aware of the natural biome that your fish occupy. And let's take, for example, an African cichlid, like a Malawi cichlid or a Tanganyikan cichlid. Now, these guys obviously inhabit rift lakes, very hard water quality, really hard liquid rock water, and a little bit side note, they tend to be really aggressive, but that's for later in the video. But let's say you're dealing with African cichlids. Generally, with a fish like that, you wouldn't want to say necessarily stock that with something like a ram. So rams, although they are a cichlid, these guys are a South American species. They need a lot softer water quality, so lower pH, as well as they're not going to have that need for all those high levels of trace elements. So you got to think about, if this animal naturally inhabits a rift lake in Africa, it may not be an appropriate fit with something like an Amazonian species, which is going to require much softer water. So you definitely need to thoroughly research the native habitat of the type of fish you're keeping. When it comes to native habitats as well, one critical factor in addition to your overall water parameters would be temperature. So certain fish, obviously like goldfish and carp, those guys are going to have a much lower temperature requirement than your soft water fish, or certainly a lot of your tropicals, which are going to be anywhere from 78 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of your goldfish and koi, we tend to keep under 74 degrees Fahrenheit. So generally anywhere 70 to 74, those guys tend to be most comfortable, although some folks will keep them a little higher. Keep that in mind when you're stocking your tank. If there's a cold water fish, like for example, if you're going to put a goldfish with a guppy, that's generally not a good mix, not only morphologically, but in terms of overall temperature, they wouldn't be a compatible fit. All right, the next thing we'll talk about is overall morphology and behavior. So what are the natural behaviors of the type of fish we're looking to keep? So let's consider certain types of fish like barbs and tetras. In general, we know that these fish tend to be schooling fish. So what does that mean? They need to be kept in a decent sized group. So we know behaviorally, for their best health, we need to keep them in a decent sized group. With certain other fish, they may only need to be kept individually or kept a couple at a time. One consideration when it does come to like the overall behavior is, keep in mind, if it's a fish like a neon tetra, keeping it by itself is not going to be the best fit overall for your tank. So if you don't have room to have a school of fish, they may not be the best choice species-wise to add to your aquarium if you can't fulfill the needs of having that basic school size of anywhere from 5 to 7. As well, when it comes to overall behavior, there are certain fish that should be kept singly. A great example of this would be the red-tailed black shark or the rainbow shark. Generally, on those types of fish, I only recommend one per system. The reason is certain fish, like with what we call co-specifics, or fish that look the same or they're like the same species, they can be particularly aggressive towards each other. So if you have two red-tailed black sharks in the same aquarium, very frequently they'll go head-to-head and it'll be no good. Another thing to consider when stocking the aquarium is, when it comes to behavior, certain fish like to occupy certain aspects of the water column. So certain fish here, like let's say our blushing white skirt tetras, these tend to be a mid-level swimmer. But if we consider other fish like killifish or like our hatchet fish, those guys tend to be a top dweller as far as occupying the water space. Conversely, certain fish like Corridora catfish, Raphael catfish, and a lot of other bottom dwellers, they occupy the bottom segment of the aquarium typically. So keep in mind when you're planning your stocking, or where is he going to fit into this biome, you need to keep in mind what section of the tank he's generally going to occupy. Now, that's not always a guarantee that they're going to hang out there, but this is a general reference guide. So for example, if I already have 4 bristlenose plecos in the bottom of my aquarium, I know that adding an additional pleco could cause some issues, especially if it's a different species and it's not like an ancestral species that are generally communal. Certain fish, they have a defined territory in the aquarium, and we need to keep that consideration in mind when we're planning our stocking or adding fish to the tank. Another consideration when it comes to behavior of the fish is keep in mind some of their habits. So for example, this is a little bit nuanced and it comes with experience within the hobby, but certain slow moving fish can definitely fall victim to even fish that we wouldn't consider necessarily an aggressive fish. A good example of this would be like certain types of plecos, especially your more carnivorous plecos or your common plecos. They're known for particularly, they can actually suck on the slime coat sometime and add lesions or cause lesions to the fish. So certain slower moving or weaker fish may not be a good choice in that type of environment. So you're gonna have to do a little bit of research as far as the nuanced care and keeping of a mixed type of tank. All right, so next consideration for our aquarium would be size of the fish. So in general, obviously, we generally recommend 1 inch per gallon when it comes to overall stocking. That's just a suggestion though, not a requirement. But we need to keep that in mind when we're stocking our tanks. So a great example of this would be, let's say we want to do a group of mollies. Well, mollies generally get about 2 inches in size, so they're a small to medium-sized fish. But they probably wouldn't be a good candidate to put with like a severum or like a red-tailed catfish. Reason being is those species are going to get way bigger than some of our other small fish in the aquarium, which could lead to aggression. It could also lead to them being eaten. So generally you need to keep things that are approximately similar size. An exception to the size rule would be, obviously, there are some larger species that can be kept with smaller fish. A good example of this would be things like neon tetras with rainbow fish. But in general, you do need to keep the appropriate adult size in mind when you plan on stocking the aquarium or adding new fish. So if I had a 10-inch red-tailed catfish in there, I probably wouldn't want to add a school of mollies. Even though the mollies aren't going to hurt the red-tailed catfish, they're probably going to end up being snacks for that fish. Category number 4 would be aggression when it comes to either planting a tank or adding new fish to your existing aquarium. So a good example of this would be like, in particular, I've seen this a lot. So let's take, for example, leopardanios or zebradanios. Now, those are generally considered a peaceful community fish. However, we've seen it before in the past where if you place a veil tail or a crown tail beta in with those guys, usually you would think on paper that's compatible. However, in our experience, and what I've seen is leopardanios and zebradanios, they tend to be really aggressive fin nippers. So it just depends on the individual mix in your tank. Keep in mind there's an active dynamic in there. Whenever a new fish is added, that changes things. So when it comes to aggression, you have to plan that out. Of course, certain fish are obviously would be a no-go. Certain things like bucktooth tetras, red belly piranhas, those guys, they're pretty much aggressive towards anything. So you're gonna have to do a species-specific tank for those fish. And for those fish, you're generally gonna know. In our store, they tend to have a red tag, which means, severe caution or look into the behavior of these guys. As well, when it comes to aggression, what I always recommend is when you're planning your tank, when you're adding fish to your tank, always add the most aggressive species last. The reason for this is, generally, if you're adding that fish last, he's gonna be the least established in the tank. He's not gonna have that time to build up that territory and just come in and attack anybody that comes into his territory. So always add your most aggressive species last when adding a new fish or planning your aquarium. By no means is this a comprehensive guide to all the definitive possibilities of stocking an aquarium, but if you have any specifics about certain species or what would or would not work great for my tank, be sure to drop in store or send us a message online. Thanks guys and have a great day.